In a world that's increasingly bizarre, one question remains. What's really going on? Join us on The Daily Absurd as we delve into the strange corners of reality, exploring the stories that make you scratch your head and say, is this real life?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going way back to 1861.
Oh, yeah.
To the Texas Secession Convention.
Okay.
And, these sources you sent in about it are fascinating.
Mhm.
They're full of all kinds of details about this pivotal moment.
I bet.
It's way more than just the basic textbook stuff,
Sounds
like we always try to do here on the Deep Dive.
You get into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
you might think, okay, so Texas seceded, we all know that.
Right.
But, there's so much more to it than that.
I'm sure.
Like, think about this.
Okay.
Sam Houston, the legend himself,
Yeah.
he's governor at the time.
Right.
And he was totally against secession.
Mm.
But somehow this convention happens anyway.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and some folks took a very creative approach
Okay.
to getting their way.
Oh.
It's really a story about how personal ambition and beliefs can collide with history.
Well, that's always the case, isn't it?
Right. It's like a political thriller.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so to set the scene, it's 1861, and 6 other southern states have already left the Union.
Right after Lincoln's election.
Yep, but Texas,
Yeah.
they decided to do things their own way,
They always have.
which I guess is very Texan.
Right.
But this really shows the unique political climate at the time. Like,
Right.
you gotta remember Sam Houston,
Oh, yeah. He's a giant.
he was a strong unionist.
Yeah.
And he fought hard to stop secession.
Hmm.
He wouldn't even call the legislature into session.
Really?
Yeah, he was hoping things would just calm down.
I see.
But, sometimes when people feel strongly about something,
Yeah.
they don't wait for permission.
They don't.
And that's exactly what happened here.
Hmm.
This group of prominent Texans,
Yeah.
they basically said, okay, Governor Houston,
Wow.
if you won't call a convention, we'll just do it ourselves.
Wow.
Bold move.
It is.
This guy, Oron M. Roberts, led the effort.
Okay.
He actually later became the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court.
Ah.
Yeah, and they just completely bypassed the governor and the legislature.
So they just held their own election.
They organized their own election for delegates.
Wow. That's
I know.
pretty audacious.
And it really shows how strong the pro-secession sentiment was.
Among some people.
Right. These weren't just some random folks.
Right.
These were powerful people
Yeah.
who were ready to challenge the governor to get their way.
That's something.
But, I'm sure that didn't sit well with everyone.
I was just thinking that.
Holding an unsanctioned election like that
Yeah.
seems a little shady.
A little bit.
Even back then, people thought it was strange.
Mm.
There were voice votes. They discouraged unionists from participating.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't fair at all.
So how can we even trust this convention?
It raises real questions about how representative it was.
Yeah.
So who were these delegates who were so eager to leave the Union?
Well, the average delegate was about 40 years old,
Okay.
mostly born in slave-holding states. And there were lots of different professions.
Okay.
But you know what stands out?
What?
Way more lawyers and slaveholders compared to the rest of Texas.
Interesting.
Makes you wonder how their personal interests influence things.
Right. It wasn't just some abstract political debate. This was
Yeah.
about power,
Yep.
economics,
Yeah,
and a system that benefited them.
definitely.
So this group of delegates,
Yeah.
they're all assembled,
Right.
and the convention officially opens on January 28, 1861.
Okay.
And guess who they elect as the presiding officer?
Who?
Oran M. Roberts,
The same guy.
the one who led that whole controversial election.
Wow.
Yeah, and in his opening speech,
Uh-huh.
he says that the delegates,
Yep.
they represent the will of the people,
Oh, really?
which is debatable
Yeah, I'd say so.
given how they got there.
Right.
So Roberts is in charge,
Yep.
and they don't waste any time.
Okay.
The very next day,
Uh-huh.
this delegate, John H. Wharton,
Okay.
he introduces a motion to secede, and it passes overwhelmingly,
Really?
152 to 6.
Wow.
That's a landslide.
It is.
I know we talked about pro-secession sentiment,
Yeah.
but that's decisive.
It really is.
So the secession movement had a ton of momentum.
Yeah.
But here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
They decide to put secession to a popular vote.
What? A referendum?
Yeah.
But why?
They clearly had the votes.
Right.
Why bother with a referendum?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, think about it.
Okay.
all that controversy surrounding the election. This could legitimize the whole thing
I see.
by letting the people vote.
Huh.
They could say, hey, we're being democratic.
Right.
Even though the convention itself was...
But not too democratic.
Right.
Smart?
So they decide to have a referendum.
Okay.
But what are the delegates doing in the meantime?
Twiddling their thumbs.
Not exactly.
Okay.
They created this committee on public safety, and this committee had a lot of power.
Oh, yeah.
They could seize federal property in Texas,
Really?
including the arsenal at San Antonio.
Wow.
So they're just taking federal property before the people even vote.
That's,
Aggressive. They also forced almost 3,000 federal troops to leave Texas.
wow. So they're acting like secession is a done deal,
Exactly.
even though the vote hasn't happened yet.
Makes you wonder how much of a choice Texans really had.
Yeah.
But we'll have to dig into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
So they're just taking over federal property,
Yeah.
kicking out the troops. It's
Oh,
like
right.
they're making secession inevitable.
Right. It's like they're saying this referendum is just for show.
Exactly.
They're manipulating the whole situation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much, say, average Texans really had.
At good point.
Like, what were those people thinking?
I mean, the ones who weren't delegates or politicians?
Yeah. What were their lives like?
What do they want?
What were they worried about?
It's easy to get caught up in all the political stuff.
Right.
But we can't forget about the everyday people.
And not everyone in Texas wanted to secede.
No, of course not.
There were lots of unionists.
Oh, yeah.
People who wanted to stay with the United States.
Their voices are often forgotten.
But they're an important part of Texas history.
Absolutely.
So what happened to those unionists?
Once secession actually happened.
Yeah. Did they just go along with it?
Well, many of them had to make really tough choices. Some stayed quiet.
Maybe out of fear?
Yeah. Maybe they were scared.
Or maybe they just felt like they couldn't do anything?
Or maybe they just thought it was pointless to resist.
Right.
And then some people actively resisted the Confederacy.
Wow, that must have been dangerous.
It was very risky.
And then some people just left Texas.
Yeah, they went to Mexico or Union territory.
To avoid fighting for a cause they didn't believe in.
Exactly.
It's amazing how people find ways to make their own choices.
Even in the middle of these huge historical events.
So the referendum happens.
On February 23rd, 1861.
And as we all know, Texans voted to secede.
Not quite by the same margin, though.
What do you mean?
It was 44,317 for secession
Okay.
and 13,020 against.
So still a pretty big difference.
Yeah, it was a clear victory for the secessionists.
But over 13,000 people voted against it.
It shows that there was real opposition.
It makes you wonder what could have happened.
If things had gone differently.
Like, what if Sam Houston had convinced more people?
Or if the delegate elections had been fair.
Right.
It's one of those big what-ifs in history.
So Texas secedes.
Yep.
And the convention meets again on March 5th
Okay.
to figure out what to do next.
Right. They had to actually make it official.
So they declared Texas independent,
Okay.
and they started making plans to join the Confederacy.
They also had to reorganize the state government.
I bet.
And one of the first things they did
Yeah.
was to require all state officials
Uh-huh.
to swear an oath to the Confederacy.
Oh, right.
That's where Sam Houston makes his stand.
The governor who fought so hard against secession.
And now they're asking him to pledge loyalty to the Confederacy.
So what did he do?
Well, Sam Houston was a man of principle.
He wasn't going to change his mind now.
He refused to take the oath.
Wow.
He said that everything the convention had done after the initial vote was illegal.
That's a bold move.
It was.
He knew it would probably end his career.
And it did.
So the convention removes him from office.
And they made Lieutenant Governor Edward Clark the new governor.
Wow.
It's a pretty traumatic fall from grace
It is.
for one of Texas's biggest heroes.
And earlier you mentioned a connection to Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
What was that all about?
Well, while all this was happening in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
the Confederate States of America was forming in Montgomery, Alabama.
Right.
And the Texas Convention had sent 7 delegates there.
To participate in the process.
Exactly.
So these Texans were helping to create the Confederacy.
From the very beginning.
They were writing the Constitution,
Yep.
establishing the government,
Fine.
and basically setting the course for this new nation. It's a sobering reminder that Texas's decision wasn't just some political game.
It had real consequences.
And it put Texas right at the center of one of the most turbulent periods in American history.
And the effects of that decision are still felt today.
Yeah, we're still dealing with the legacy of slavery
States' rights.
and trying to reconcile our past with our hopes for the future.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but I think we're doing a good job of unpacking it all.
I hope so.
But, we've talked a lot about the political stuff.
Right, the big picture.
But what about the average Texan?
Yeah, what about the everyday people?
What were their lives like during this time?
How did this crisis affect them personally?
That's a great question.
And it's a question that often gets overlooked.
We need to remember that this wasn't just some debate.
It was a time of huge uncertainty.
And upheaval for ordinary people.
The economy was a mess.
Families were being torn apart.
And war was looming.
We should explore that more in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm ready when you are.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on, like, the big events.
Right, the political stuff.
But I always wonder about the regular people.
The average Texans.
Yeah, like, how did they experience all of this?
Right, what was it like for a farmer out in East Texas?
Or a shopkeeper in Galveston?
Yeah, as all this craziness was happening.
Well, it must have been a stressful time.
Oh, definitely. It wasn't just about politics.
Right.
It was a time of huge uncertainty.
And disruption.
For ordinary people.
What about the economy?
Oh, yeah, that was a mess.
I bet.
The threat of secession really shook things up.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it actually happened,
Yeah.
it disrupted trade with the North.
I see.
Businesses didn't know what to do.
Right.
There was just a lot of instability.
And then you have families being divided.
Oh, yeah, communities torn apart.
Because of these loyalties.
It must have been so difficult.
Can you imagine?
Having family on opposite sides of this issue?
And knowing that war might be coming?
That's a level of stress we can hardly imagine.
So we've talked about the delegates.
Uh-huh.
And their reasons for secession. But what about the people who voted in the referendum?
Yeah, the average Texans.
What were they thinking?
Well, the sources show a lot of different motivations.
Okay.
For some, it was about protecting their way of life.
Which was tied to slavery.
Exactly. They were afraid of the abolitionist movement.
In the North.
Yeah, they saw secession as the only way to protect their interests.
And for others?
It was about Texas independence.
That go-it-alone spirit.
Right. They didn't trust the federal government.
They wanted Texas to make its own choices.
That idea of states' rights was really important to them.
But not everyone agreed.
No, there were those 13,000 votes against secession.
Right. What about those people?
Well, some of them were definitely strong unionists.
Believed in staying united.
Exactly.
But others might have been worried about the economy.
Yeah, what would secession mean for their businesses?
Their jobs.
Their livelihoods.
And you have to wonder about the role of fear. I mean, Texas was a slaveholding society.
Right.
But there were people who opposed slavery. Were they afraid to speak out?
Against secession.
Yeah, maybe they were worried about what would happen to them.
It's possible.
It took a lot of courage to stand up for your beliefs.
Especially when they were unpopular.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
In this deep dive.
We've seen the behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
The political battles.
The fight over Sam Houston.
Yeah. It's a story full of drama and intrigue.
Moral dilemmas.
And the weight of history.
It really makes you think.
Doesn't it?
So as we wrap up,
okay,
I want to leave you with something to consider, knowing what we know now.
About the Civil War and everything that happened.
How do you think Texans today view this period?
It's a tough question.
It is.
I think there's pride in Texas's independence.
That maverick spirit.
Yeah, that willingness to do things their own way.
But there's also a growing awareness of the negative side.
The injustice.
The suffering caused by secession.
It's a reminder that history is complicated.
It's not just good or bad.
It's a mix of everything.
And it's up to us to learn from it.
To understand it.
And to figure out what it means for us today.
Well said.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive.
Time flies.
It really does. Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, keep exploring those hidden depths of history.